So thank you everyone for joining us for this evening's BMS Talk. It's my pleasure to introduce our chair, Claire Blencoe, who's an amateur mycologist and active member of both the West Weald and Sussex fungus groups. And she's also the Darwin Tree of Life Project Coordinator, Fungi and Plants, at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. So over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great honour to be invited to host tonight's webinar in the BMS webinar series and be here with Chris. Chris, I think you're going to talk for up to an hour this evening, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And if you have any questions for Chris, please type them into the chat as we go along, and I'll be reviewing those and come back to them at the end. We'll have some time for Q&A then. So Chris, I think last time I met you, we were striding across the windswept pastures of Northumberland. So
Absolutely.
I know you do a lot of different fungus surveys and monitoring all across the UK. And you're also an associate tutor with the Field Studies Council. So I'm really looking forward to your talk tonight and hearing all about fungal habitats. And I'm sure everyone here is too. So I'm going to hand over to you now and come back later.
Well, thanks, Ben. Thank you for the fabulous introduction. I've got to say I'm totally flattered to be here. I'm a big fan of all the fascinating BMS talks that we've heard so far over the last couple of years. Today, as you'll know from the title, we're going to take a few steps back from the usual groundbreaking research and instead have a look at the wider picture that can be of particular interest to anyone getting involved in field mycology. So whether we're setting off alone for a relaxing afternoon's walk in search of fungi, or we're going out on an organised foray with like-minded folk, we can be sure of several factors that are going to influence the species that we're likely to find on the day, but none perhaps as much as the habitats that we're going to visit. So I can, of course, put forward a really good argument that there are diverse and amazing fungi that have evolved to thrive in pretty much every possible habitat on the planet, from the deep seas to mountaintops, from deserts to swamps. Then at a much smaller scale, there are those fungi that can only be found in the nectaries of flowers, the abdomens of insects, or our own stomachs and skin. Today, though, I intend to discuss the range of common habitats where we're going to tend to look for macrofungi. And by macrofungi, I'm referring to those species that are larger, fleshier, and typically mushroom-like. Another word would be the basidiomycota or basidiomycetes, as compared to microfungi, many of which are not visible to the naked eye, but including those that might only be a couple of millimeters in size. Anyway, I think for many people, the first habitat they'd think of would be the woods. So while that is an excellent place to start, when thinking about where we're going to look for fungi, things are never that simple. Woodland is a really broad concept, so I'm going to start by breaking it down a little bit. So in the widest sense, woodlands or forests of the world can be divided by the sort of climactic areas that they are associated with, the climates that they appear in. I should say at this point, in case there are any cartographers watching this evening, I heartily apologise. Map making is obviously not my strong point. And I promise that apart from these two you're about to see, there aren't many more maps that I've hastily scribbled together through the rest of the talk. Anyway, as you can see, tropical forests are found nearest the equator, and because of that, they've got higher temperatures and more rainfall. Temperate forests are found to the north and south of that, and are sort of between there's borders of dry areas north and south of the tropics, and so then you get the temperate forests north and south of those borders. And then boreal forests or boreal forests are only found in the northern hemisphere, and they're in areas of high altitude that tend to get long periods of cold weather, often freezing for several months at a time. So although the British Isles have a comparatively tiny landmass compared to the sort of size of scale of continents that we were just looking at, they are home to two of those forest types, or sort of they are home to two of those forest types. The scattered Caledonian pine forests, those sort of remnants that we have in the northern Scotland, are an oceanic form of the vast boreal forests that range all the way from Canada through to China. When I say oceanic, by the way, I'm just referring to the fact that these woods are affected by higher humidity because of their proximity to the sea, in this case the Atlantic, than other ranges of boreal forests that could be easily thousands of miles from the sea. Anyway, as you might imagine, this still means that there are parts of the mainland UK in which we can go and look at fungi that evolved to thrive in these colder, high altitude conditions. So there's some really specialist fungi that we can find by heading for those areas. And they would have, those trees and fungi would have begun colonizing those areas at the end of the last ice age, and they're just the bits that we've got left. But the fact that we have these two climate regions and therefore associated woodlands, I think makes us fantastically lucky. But of the temperate forests that we find in the majority, the rest of the country, well, from a fungal perspective, I'd say we're quite blessed. In the types of woodland we're all accustomed to on these islands, many species of tree make something called ectomycorrhizal associations with a fabulous range of fungus species. And those species make up a good proportion of those big, agaricoid, typically mushroomy fungi that people generally associate with their autumn walks, their foraying, and their foraging. By comparison, although tropical forests are also filled with fungi, only about 3% of their mycorrhizal associations are of this type. So you won't see anything like the species richness and diversity of those types of fungi that we do get here in the temperate forests. Now, I'm not going to go into explaining everything about mycorrhizal associations as part of this talk, but just to simply summarize, I'm referring to a sort of mutualistic relationship that is formed between trees and fungi that make them appear to be sort of fairly codependent on each other. And they can be really diagnostic in helping you identify a species of fungus, or indeed identifying a species of tree if you've learnt it the other way around. Anyway, it is a massive and fascinating topic. If you don't know what I'm talking about with these mycorrhizal and ectomycorrhizal associations, I suggest after the talk, have a wee Google for something like symbiotic tree fungi, and prepare to be amazed. But anyway, we're sticking with woodlands as a habitat. So we've looked at the big scale. I would like to divide them up a little further. The type of woodland that the species of tree and plants that grow there, even the geology below the soil, can have a distinct impact on which fungi you find when you go out. And understanding these habitat qualities can really help you with identifying your finds. So there are factors that you're going to see in the habitats relating to either the geology, the soil, the species of trees, the plants, or the broader habitats themselves, that can really help you identify the fungi at the end of the day. So the two main types of woodland in the UK are broadleaf, which there's an image of on the left, and coniferous on the right. So that's our pine woods, spruce woods, plantations, things like this. Although you'll often find a combination of the two, it's much more natural that we would find something that we call mixed woodland, where there's a blending of those species. Now, there are quite a few species of fungi, things like steriums and postia, I guess to a lesser extent, something like Hyphiloma, that once you know that the sort of genus that you're in, the group of fungi that you are trying to identify, all you need to know is were those fungi growing on rotten broadleaf wood or rotten conifer wood, and then you're going to be able to get yourself a pretty accurate identification. So some woods are dominated by, I say that there's mixes of woods, but some woods are dominated by one or two species of tree. So in this instance, we've got oak, beech, birch, and pine woods, often referred to as sort of the big four for fungal foraging and foraging. Or there might be different conditions encouraging different species. So, for example, if the ground is very waterlogged, areas are more likely to host willow trees or alder trees, which are more tolerant of that. Although some species of fungi are generalists, many can be specific to one of these habitat types or to certain species of tree. So while all woodlands are going to be supported by fungi, the species you can expect to find can really be determined by the type of woodland that it is. So for the ever popular showy mycorrhizal species, which is things like amanitas, boletes, chanterelles, webcaps, poison pies, fiber caps, deceivers, milk caps, roll rims, brittle gills, the knight, there's many more. It's always best to spend your time becoming aware of woodland that has a high percentage or one or more of these tree species. So again, that's your well, from left to right, your pines, your oaks, your beeches, and your birches. And the reason is when autumn comes round, you're going to know where to start looking, where to head out for the best success. Each of those species tend to have a much greater number of mycorrhizal associations than other trees, like hawthorns or elm trees, which rarely have associating fungi, or species like sycamore, ash, holly, rowan trees, yew trees, which don't have any of them. So moving on from, I say that a big four, the wet western coasts of these isles should be home to Atlantic woodlands, our very own temperate Celtic rainforests, dripping in lichens, rich in specializing fungi. Unfortunately, centuries of habitat loss and agriculture grazing leading to habitat loss have left us with threatened, fragmented communities of these woodlands, but they are still out there. Atlantic oak woods can still be located in areas like South and West Wales, the Lake District, the west coast of Scotland, and the southern west coasts of Ireland. And depending on the sort of managed or sort of the previous the use by people in the past, at the history of each site, the quality of those habitats can vary. So some examples of Atlantic woodland habitat can just be oak plantations from the 19th century, sort of industries that would have been there, things like charcoal burning or the tanning industries that would have set up near to these oak woodlands, and as they stripped out the timber, they would have been replanting as they go, and we can now see those plantations, and there's enough continuity that they were able to pick up that the sort of habitat type and in those areas, and because of that, we don't need to write them off. They can still provide you with some wonderful fungal surprises, even in sort of these 100-year, 150-year-old plantations. Much more scarce and far older than our Atlantic oak woodlands are our Atlantic hazel woods. Mostly now they are only found on fairly inaccessible stretches of the west coast of Scotland, but actually they're surviving relics of the original sort of hazelwoods that would have been colonising the land following the retreating ice at the end of the last ice age. So these are sort of the remnants of that. In other western coastal areas, southern coastal areas, though, across the British Isles, you will find pockets of that habitat. It's just not extensive, and it's often mixed in with other woodland types. So again, it's just getting to know your local woodlands around the coasts and finding areas of hazel. It's quite likely that you're going to find the same sort of fungal communities that you would in some of the best bits of perhaps on the west coast of Scotland. The image on the right there, the hazel gloves fungus, is just one of those rare, fascinating fungi that you might find there and very unlikely to find in other places. Another type of woodland, the wet woodlands. So these are things like willow carr and alder carr. These are also home to fungi you wouldn't expect to find anywhere else. And that's due to their very wet, tangled nature. They're often left unexplored. If somebody was wanting to go and visit those spaces, it's certainly best to be wearing some chest waders and making sure somebody knows that where you've gone. They're not necessarily the most ideal place to take groups of people for a foray, but they can be exceptional for the fungi that you'll find there. So these carr habitats occur in wet, usually peaty areas where there's enough organic matter has accumulated above the waterline that those spaces those areas of organic matter accumulating are able to be colonized by willows and alders that can tolerate putting their roots down deeper and having their roots remain wet for long periods of time, which many other species of tree wouldn't tolerate. We've lost vast amount of this habitat across the country. That's mostly due to land drainage for agriculture and development. It's one of the first things to go, is bits of wet woodland. But there are patches of it left, really widely distributed right across the British Isles. So pretty much any region that you're living in, it'll be possible to go and find this type of wet woodland habitat. On the right this time, something that always fills me with joy, seeing these wee mycenas on the right-hand side. And they just grow on the wet, mossy trunk of trees in these habitats. And depending on how big your screen is, there's about 10 or more, I think, sort of hidden away there in the moss, larger than life in this image. So with those sort of general broad ideas of different woodland types that we might go and look for, all these types of woodland are more likely to support a greater diversity of fungi as they mature. And incredibly old veteran trees are known to support far more biodiversity than younger trees. But when it comes to fungi, though, those veteran trees might host some of the rarest wood rotting fungi in the UK, but they don't always necessarily have a greater number of fungal associations than younger mature trees. There's a sort of almost bell curve of the number of associating fungi that you will find. Starts off lower with a brand new sapling going in, builds up into mature trees that have associated with many species, and then as that tree becomes a veteran, it might select or choose to associate with fewer of better providers in the better providing fungal associates. So to be clear, an ancient woodland may be home to some veteran trees, the sort of things we see on the image to the left there. But it doesn't have to be. An ancient woodland is more defined by the length of continuous time that that site has been a woodland than necessarily the age of the trees within it. So the longer that that area has been wooded for, the greater the fungal diversity will be. If to make sense of that, it could be that several times over the last few hundred years, there has been heavy timber extraction or logging in that area, but at no point you've necessarily had no trees on the site, meaning there has been the possibility for fungal associates and wood rotting fungi that are there to still have trees that they were able to associate with or break down. And so when new trees were either planted or regenerated naturally, they were still there on the ground, as opposed to perhaps a site that was clear felled and kept there for 10 years, where you wouldn't have that level of continuity. So yeah, the longer that the area has been wooded for, the greater the diversity of fungi will generally be. A healthy ancient woodland won't just have really old trees either. It will have trees with a diverse age range. Seedlings and the younger trees, the whips, they're going to benefit greatly from joining in with the fungal associations that already exist with the older trees. And it's that continuity of species associations that's really going to set the mature woodlands apart from a younger plantation. So when sort of thinking where the best place might be to go for a foray, it's always worth going out to younger, newer plantation, maybe only 20, 30 years old, but you're almost certainly going to see greater diversity in a mature woodland, or indeed an ancient woodland. Some rare tree associating fungi are also likely to be found only in those ancient woodlands. Those species can be rarer for a number of reasons, but things like producing mushrooms or fruit bodies irregularly, having a really low spore yield, not producing that many spores, and having poor spore dispersal techniques, or having poor technique is not the right word, having poor spore dispersal. These are all issues that would have perhaps been fine in medieval forests that once covered the islands, where the spores did not have to travel so far or in such great numbers to find new hosts, places to thrive. But in the modern world, with habitat fragmentation, it has become a real issue for those species. So it's a big factor for their survival and their ability to colonize new suitable host trees and forests that may be many, many miles away. So how to find these ancient woodlands? Historical maps can be a really useful tool for identifying the areas that you could look at and say that's an ancient woodland. And one of the reasons is ancient woodlands can really easily be lost within bigger, more recently established woodlands, unless there's a big signpost near the car park that says ancient woodland this way. So there'll be areas that perhaps had large plantation woodlands put in the 1970s, but somewhere in there's 2 or 3 pockets of older mixed woodland that has got a history going back hundreds of years because it was in a difficult to reach spot. I often turn to this tool that's on the screen, which is on the National Library of Scotland website, to help me find or look at the history of a wooded site. Just briefly, the way it works is it's a split screen down the middle. You select an area that you want to go and visit using a current map, like there on the right. And then on the other half of the screen, you can select from dozens of older maps for the other half of the page. So as you move around on one of the maps and to check other nearby areas, the other map will adjust itself accordingly. And if the map doesn't go back far enough, you can select another map. For most areas that I've looked around the UK, there are maps going back at least a couple of 100 years. So that can be a really useful tool. But as well, sort of local history societies and stuff might be a good place to go. I've talked quite a bit there then about some of the main woodland types you can find, but within each of those woodland types, there are going to be dozens of different habitat niches that fungi are going to be exploiting. So some species have evolved to survive in the high, dry, dead branches that are way above our heads. Others are going to be infecting the living leaves of the plants at our feet, in forms of things like rusts or smuts and stuff. And there's going to be countless more species remaining invisible to us pretty much that are in the soil and all around us in the dead wood and the leaf litter and stuff. So I'll now sort of move on to speak about those fungi, particularly these ones that break down wood, twigs, leaves, and pretty much any other dead organic plant matter. And this type of fungi that do that, we either call them recyclers, or a term that is often used is saprophyte. So over millennia, these saprophytic fungi have evolved to break down the different physical and chemical structures in plants. That plays a crucial role in the recycling of organic litter back into soil, releasing nutrients for the rest of the ecosystem. And you're going to find there are different species of fungi active at different stages of wood decay. So the term I've used here, standing deadwood, is obviously involving trees that have died or partially died, but have not yet fallen over. But it can also include just dead branches that are still attached to a dead or living standing tree, as with the two images here. But there is another aspect of what I might refer to as standing deadwood, and that's a sort of standing dead, or sort of standing dead heartwood of a tree. So to explain, as a tree grows, the living part of the trunk remains at the outer edge of the tree beneath the bark, and that leaves the center and a sort of annually expanding area of dead heartwood at the core of the trunk. Now, there are several specialist species of fungus that have evolved to break this deadwood down. It's a process that can take many decades, at least many decades in some species like a big old oak. And that's partly because things like oaks produce lots of complex chemical tannins and other defenses that make them more impervious to lots of fungal attacks. So the fungi that have adapted to be able to do this have become very, very specialized, and usually only with one species of tree. One species like this that has evolved to overcome that sort of defense is the beefsteak fungus, which is there on the left of the screen. When you see a veteran tree with its center all completely rotten away, like the right-hand side, it might seem like these fungi are having a really negative effect on the host tree, but in fact, they're providing a great benefit to mature and ancient trees. When a mature tree is facing strong winds, the hollow cylinder is a much more resilient structure and a flexible structure than a solid cylinder. And so by removing the dead center of a mature ancient tree, these fungi can really help to extend the life of the ancient trees, sometimes by hundreds of years. Just as a by the by, when you see trees like this in this state, they tend to be referred to as a hulk. So the tree can continue living. It might drop its branches again. That helps with wind resistance. It's less likely to be toppled by being out of balance. But it's a stronger, better structure, and mostly down to the hollowing out by these specializing fungi. So that was standing deadwood. Obviously, anyone that's walked in the woods is going to have seen a lot of fallen deadwood or tripped over it. With regards to large woody debris like boughs, branches, tree trunks, as opposed to sort of thin sticks and twigs, once these come into contact with the ground, the wood is able to absorb much more moisture into it. So it's in a sponge-like way, it's going to absorb moisture up from the ground, and that makes it far more appealing to a much wider diversity of wood-rotting saprophytic fungi. In the photo on the left, you should be able to make out at least 2 species there, but there are many more. If you zoom in closer, you're going to see several more. Lots of those are going to look like black dots, black crusts, and until you examine them, if you were there in person and you had a look at them with a hand lens, you're going to see they come in all manner of forms. This usually the Ascomycota are small spore shooting species that I definitely said I wasn't talking about so much at the beginning of the talk. So those species are going to be there in large numbers as well. And now down underneath the log, in both those cases, there are likely to be larger crust-forming fungi. So these crust fungi are ubiquitous on fallen deadwood, but they're often overlooked, and they're certainly under-recorded due to the difficulty with sort of identifying them. Many of them need quite a bit of microscopy to get them right. They're a fascinating group to look at, really amazing structures under the microscope, but it has limited the number of people that look at them. They're sometimes referred to as corticioid or recipienate fungi, and those names are catching a bunch of species that come from a whole different ends of the family tree, as it were, unrelated genera. But they share this common morphology of looking like somebody spilt Tipex down underneath a log or a branch. Essentially these flat crusts against wood or bark. For most of them, their favorite habitat is going to be the underside of fallen deadwood. The only thing I'd suggest is always remember to put them back as they were once you've turned the log over and had a look at them. Down a similar vein of wood rotting fungi, stumps. Stumps are obviously formed in several different ways. Either catastrophic events occur, like physical impacts, or lightning strikes can snap off the trunk near to the base, or there might be a buttress root rotting fungus that might weaken the base of a tree, making it susceptible to breaking off, snapping off in windy conditions. Or human activity might involve cutting a tree back to a stump to encourage regrowth, sort of encompassing, or cutting a tree back to harvest timber, or as often now the case, people cutting trees back to stumps to remove disease-infected trees. In all these circumstances, there are fungi that will opportunistically colonize this newly available resource and begin to break it down. They're going to recycle the trapped nutrients, making them available again, just as the other wood rotters are doing. Eventually, it's going to become difficult to distinguish where the soil ends and a stump starts. And it's starting to happen between the images on the left and the right here. And I'd say for somebody out looking to ID things out on foray, that can become confusing because it's becoming a transitional habitat, as you're going to start finding not just wood rotting fungi, as the ones on both these images are. But you're going to also find soil dwelling fungi starting to appear during the later stages of decomposition, because it is the sort of ivy, the fungal mass is able to move into this almost soil-like structures of the decomposing wood. So it's a sort of transitional habitat in some of this dead wood and stumps that you'll find on the ground. So fallen dead wood is referring to larger trunks and boughs, big sticks, big woody debris. The woodland floor is obviously home to a huge quantity of small woody debris, like small sticks, twigs, wood chip, splinters. And again, there's a huge diversity of fungi that have evolved to break down these smaller resources. The extensive use of wood chip that we now see around housing estates and parks, gardens, car parks, that's led to a huge increase in records of fungi that specialize on that resource. So just in recent decades, thinking something like red lead roundheads, things that we were little or not recorded sort of 30, 40 years ago, are becoming far more common to find because of human use of spreading wood chip down as mulch or decorative cover. Leaf litter is even more ephemeral than this woody debris, but it's another habitat in itself. So you're going to see seasonal changes more in the amount of leaf litter. But it's still worth having in mind when thinking about or going out, and where you're going to look for if there's drifts of leaf litter built up in some areas. It's always worth a check. The fungi that have evolved to recycle that resource have had to develop methods of avoiding desiccation, and that's because the surface of the soil and above the soil is much more prone to drying out because of wind and sunlight than the soil itself. As well as they've needed to evolve achieving rapid spore dispersal, and that's because leaf litter is broken down really quickly, and it's vital therefore that the fungi are able to create the spore producing structures that mushrooms or the fruit bodies that can release the spores quickly so they can colonize new resources, because the resource that they're in is not going to be there for long. So obviously you can find a variety of different habitats in most woodlands. There are endless microhabitats, and most of them are going to be hosting some different niche fungi that is exploiting the resources there. And these habitats and microhabitats not only vary from one woodland to woodland, but then you're going to see lots of them across single sites, even small sites. There are some hotspots I would always recommend, if you're sort of visiting a large site and it's where to lead a group or where to head with on a foray or a walk. And that is areas where one habitat type is going to meet another. So if there are 30 hectares of fantastic oak woodland, you're unlikely to walk through them all in a day. And you're unlikely necessarily to see a massive diversity of species after the first couple of, or 2 or 3 hours of looking through there. So it's worth picking some areas of that woodland where one habitat meets another. In the examples here on the left, there's a riverbank at the edge of a woodland. On the right, where the woods peter out into open grassland. Other things can be glades within woods, freshwater ponds and stuff, again, will sort of break up woodlands. Even the fact of paths, trails, landslips, all of these are going to have caused some change in habitat, and you're more likely, in my experience, to find a different fungi there than you might otherwise in the centre of similar parts of woodland on the same site. In broadleaf woodland, where you might have a denser canopy, where the water sort of runs off at the edge of that, the drip line can be a standalone tree, or where there is a denser woodland, is where rain is sort of falling from the edges into an open space. That can be a goldmine spot for looking for fungi that you don't necessarily find 20 meters back under the canopy, and that's partly because there is going to be a greater water resource in that drip line area. So it's possible to find pretty much every single one of the different types of woodland habitat, woodland type, and woodland microhabitat and stuff. Pretty much all of the things that I've mentioned so far, you might find being grazed, and that might be by cattle, sheep, wild herbivores like deer or rabbits, and this will often, generally, create an open structure beneath the trees, and that again is going to allow you to see different fungi. Not necessarily, yeah. There's likely to be home to be different fungi, and certainly it's going to be easier to see fungi there than under denser vegetation, sort of deep bracken or something like that you might find otherwise. At the extreme end of that, grazed woodland pastures or parkland habitat, the sort of thing that you typically think of around stately homes, big, well grazed grass fields interspersed by large boughs spread mature trees. They're sort of all levels on a scale of grazed woodland. These are those sort of woodland pastures and parkland. They're typified more by large open areas between widely spaced trees, and it's much more likely in those habitats you're going to find your usual woodland species. They're associating with either the living trees themselves in the mycorrhizal association kind of way, or buried dead wood, dead roots under the soil, and they might be well interspersed with the sort of species that you would find in grasslands, which I'll cover grassland habitat shortly. Yeah, other habitat features in woodlands are, like I say, things like ponds, areas with non-native plantations can sometimes have non-native species of fungi that are associated with them, glades, rides through them, but then anything like log piles, sort of man-made log piles, or man-made woodland sort of styles, fences, they're all going to be bringing something different to that woodland, perhaps a species of timber that's not present in that woodland, which might then have wood rotting fungi on it that you wouldn't otherwise find in that habitat. So again, it's this thing of meeting of two different types of habitat. So I just mentioned grassland. Grassland is really it's a generic term describing a wide variety of habitats. Though, as the name suggests, species of grass are usually the most dominant vegetation type. I would say it's not always the case, though. There's things like you can walk through a field that's mostly prevalent with common rush, and it's still going to be often considered called as a grassland, just a poorer quality one. So in the British Isles, our main types, it's not all of them, but our main types of UK grassland are acid grasslands. These are found on nutrient poor, acidic soils, and you find them typically in upland areas, sort of heaths and moors. Neutral grasslands occur on soils with a neutral or a much more neutral pH, and they're commonly found in lowland areas. And then we've got a calcareous grassland, and those are pretty much restricted to soils that are thinly spread or sitting on chalk or limestone, and they are not all, they're mostly found in parts of southern England, as well as the west of England, a bit in the lakes, Wales. And coastal grasslands, those are found along the UK's coast, obviously, and the sort of vegetation and the soils you get there are being influenced by the amount of salt spray and wind erosion, things like that. I should briefly mention with these sorts of acid grassland, neutral grasslands and calcareous grasslands, back at the beginning I was mentioning that soil type and the underlying geology can make a big difference. And in some ways we think, well, that's an acid grassland, so it's going to have these species of plant. This woodland has got a run of sort of calcareous geology running through it, so that's going to have different types of plants there. And it's always worth, I think, bringing back to mind that many of these habitats exist as they do because the fungi are able to tolerate the acid conditions or the base conditions in there, and it's them that allow the plant and tree species to live there, rather than it's a habitat and these fungi have moved into it. It's really the fungi that are, in many instances, have pushed into those different sort of geological types, of which, of course, in the British Isles we have a big diversity. Anyway, back to grasslands. So for each of those types of acid grassland base, calcareous, and coastal grasslands, there are ways that we can classify our influence on them. Those are improved, semi-improved, and unimproved. So improved grassland, that's referring to areas that have been really intensively managed for usually agricultural purposes. They're going to perhaps been sown with high yield, lush green grass species, regularly fertilized, perhaps grazed by livestock, often grazed by livestock. Or they might have had the additions of lots of chemical fertilizer, or they're ploughed regularly or annually. Unimproved grassland, that's going to refer more to grasslands that have not been as intensively managed. They've not gone such significant human interventions, usually sort of not for agricultural purposes in the same way. And they're going to have more natural vegetation that's evolved over time, less intensive cultivation sort of going on. And they are going to have, from a plant point of view, a higher level of biodiversity than improved, than the semi-improved grasslands, which, yeah, sort of sit halfway in between. Completely unimproved grasslands, these typically consist of the native species that were there 200 years ago, well adapted to their local environment, the local soil conditions. They have had minimal or no influence from human management, no sort of significant human interventions at all. And these, from, again, a plant and wildlife point of view, we tend to think of them as ranging a broader diversity of wildlife, the grasses and wildflowers and the lake. So traditionally, for that, an improved grassland, which we're sort of picking out as the ideal there for wildlife, has been measured by looking at the diversity of the plant species, the botanical indicators. This can often be rare plants that you only find on these nutrient poor or unimproved habitats. However, it has been shown that really there is evidence to show that it's only really a measure of how botanically rich that unimproved grassland is. There is evidence that botanically poor but similarly unimproved grasslands might still support a wide range of really specialist, amazing grassland fungi, and therefore a key fungus species, or that there is a list of key fungus species, might be better indicators of the time and the extent to which a grassland has not been improved for than perhaps the plant indicators. Most grasslands really will have some kind of soil or moss, plant associating fungi in them, but it's these unimproved grasslands where you're going to find wonderful waxcaps, clubs, corals, pink gills. If you want to know more about all those amazing species of grassland fungi and why our British populations of them are so very important, there is another BMS talk that was recorded. It's called Grassland Fungi, Recorded and Conservation in England. That Claire and Sean did. It's on the website, on the BMS website, you can go and look at. And another common feature of the majority of grasslands, is the likelihood that they're going to be grazed by something. So whether that's cattle, sheep, deer, rabbits, geese, and the dung that they produce is again a really important microhabitat for many more species of fungi. So when you're out and you're looking at this habitat that's grassland that has this other habitat within it, which is the dung that's there. And there's another talk on the BMS website that really goes fantastically into those species and how to look at them. That one's called The Dung Lovers, an introduction to coprophilous fungi. And that was from around this time last year, but it's on the website. So edging away from grasslands, there are several species of fungi that you're going to only find in sand dunes. And these are really often great. So it's a really good habitat to go and look in, because there's often only one or two species from any genus or group of fungi that does this or lives in this habitat, which makes them much easier to identify, which is handy. Again, though, as with the woodlands and the grasslands, some of the best parts of coastal habitats are actually where this habitat runs into another. So a woodland that's petering out into the dune system, or a sort of wildflower grass area of salt tolerant plants giving away to marram grass, the sort of dune grass. Those are going to be your real fungi hotspots of the coast. For wetlands, obviously, as a photo in the middle there, you can go to huge marshes, bogs, and there are going to be fungi that specialize in being there. And some of them with things like the moss, or breaking down the huge amounts of organic matter that you'll find. Habitats like that are not necessarily great for accessibility, though. There's going to be a lot of troughs and holes, often hidden by vegetation. It's trouble for the knees, and wet legs. So they're not necessarily the best habitats for perhaps taking a foray through, but you get smaller areas of wet habitats in grasslands, in woodlands, in lots of other areas. You're going to start seeing things like the bog beacon on the left there can appear in lots of different wet habitats. So it's always, again, thinking any habitat that you're in, keeping in mind of where wetter areas are, because at different points of the year, it might be as a really wet area dries up a little bit in the summer that you start seeing some of the fungi that are managing to thrive there. There are lots of other habitats that I could go on for hours. But yes, the montane habitats, again, so once you get up beyond a certain height and a certain altitude, you're going to see different fungi exploiting that habitat there. Heath and I already mentioned a little bit. Arable land is usually considered, generally and rightly considered, to be fairly poor for fungi. But that doesn't mean that the hedgerows and edges of that land are as well. So there is still some value if you live in an area surrounded by arable land. There is still some likely hotspots where the fungi are going to be around that area. Brownfield sites, I'm not necessarily talking about a demolished factory, but certainly something that might be old quarries and slag heaps and things like this, bings. Again, a different habitat where you're getting different types of early stage colonizers there that might be outcompeted once vegetation really takes hold, or other stronger vegetation takes hold, trees start to come in, then you start seeing the species, more common species to perhaps a grassland or a woodland. So brownfield sites can be great for some edgy early colonizing species. Old orchards, there are species that you're only going to find on things like old apple trees and stuff, as either parasites or associates and stuff. So they can be great. And for many of us, we live in urban areas, and I'd say there's no limit there. Parks are fabulous. Cemeteries can have a wonderful array of fungi in them. If there's pathways following old railway lines or something like that from the previous industrial heritage, just stepping off the path, avoiding the dog mess, but stepping off the path and having a look there can be really rewarding. Even supermarket car parks where they have a bunch of landscaping at the edges, they've got that wood chip there, there might be things in, again, shrub planting and stuff like that, depending on the species, could be great places to have a look. So yeah, urban environments are not a restriction. Often even semi-industrial, like industrial estates, will have lots of areas between the car park and the factory where nobody ever walks, and there's a bit of scrubland, but it's always worth having a wee look there. And of course, our own gardens. Here's a fungi that are sort of colonized bits of old carpet used as a mulch on a flower bed over winter. Fungi popping up in flower pots is really, really common. But there's lots that we can do in our own gardens, local community spaces, parks, gardens, allotments and stuff that make things better for fungi. And if we think back to some of those best example habitats that I've just gone through, it would be things like, so if there is a mature tree, that's going to be a great bonus. Even if it's in the next door's garden, you're likely to see more fungi because of it being there than if it wasn't. If there's a possibility of planting trees, and then you know that it's only a matter of years away and you'll start seeing the fungal benefits of having done that. Lawns, not feeding the lawns, allowing the lawns to naturalize more, and you're going to start seeing more grassland fungi in your own lawns. And we can recreate the sort of litter layers and deadwood of a fantastic mature woodland by putting but the leaves that have been swept up off the driveway, leaving them in a pile in the corner, around a pile of logs and bits of woody stuff where you cut the shrubs back. And so a bit of a sort of log pile with leaf litter and stuff. All of these things are going to mean that you don't have to walk nearly as far to go and find a fantastic fungal habitat. Okay, so just looking at the time, that's me. I'll stop just there.
Thanks, Chris. That was absolutely great. I think kingdom fungi can be so overwhelmingly vast. Habitat is a really useful frame for sort of cutting down the different assemblages that you might come across in any given location. And that was a very inspiring canter through real diverse set of habitats in the UK.
Thank you. Canter was the pace I felt I was going to try and fit
Yeah.
stuff in. Yes.
Yeah, I'm based down on the near the south coast, so it's fantastic to see all those lovely lush habitats that you must have going out around Edinburgh and the Lothians up there. We've got a few questions coming in, so are you ready for
Okay.
questions? Do you need a glass of water or anything?
Brace myself.
Yeah. I'll start taking them in order. So Trisha, you were talking about ancient woodlands and problems with habitat fragmentation. Trisha's asked if there's any research about distances for spore dispersal. Do you know about that?
Yes, there definitely is. And I'm racking my brain. There have been papers specifically on some of the, particularly the heartwood rotting species of ancient oak and beech trees, but I cannot off the top of my head go, oh, it was such and such's paper
Yeah.
in 1997. I can't do that, but there's certainly the research is out there where, yeah, things like spore dispersal of certain species was being recorded.
And you also showed us some fantastic woodland photos with some plantations as well as more natural woodland. And Gustav was asking, I wonder how spruce plantations are affecting fungal diversity. In his experience, they seem rather poor. And do you think that would be due to simply poor planting practice or a lack of mycorrhizal associates?
Okay, so there are, spruce does have a good number really of mycorrhizal associating fungi. There are issues at the younger that plantation, if it was clear felled at some point, in the last 20 years, as I think lots of the big 1960s, 70s plantations now have been. So replanted areas, if there was a big gap, those mycorrhizal species are unlikely to have survived the gap between hand. But I agree. I know what you mean. You often go into something like a spruce plantation and you go, aha, these are the three species, and you can walk for 2 hours and you're still going to see the same three species over and over. I think it is a lot. Yeah, I feel rather than know that is a lot more to do with tight planting, encouraging the trees to grow very tall, blocking out any other sort of plant growth and stuff at the ground level. So you've got this sort of monoculture system. Whereas if there was a little bit more diversity in the spruce plantation, you're going to see a greater diversity of fungi.
Right, another one of the things that I found really interesting about your talk was highlighting how dynamic a lot of habitats are. So when you've got tree stumps rotting down, it's sort of transitioning from one habitat to another. And Iona has asked, if a tree has developed a polypore species on it, does that mean the tree is dying? She keeps hearing people saying that a tree needs to be cut down because it's dying. But is that going to have an effect on the fungi prevalence in that area? Is that right?
So the difficulty in answering that is it will entirely depend on the species there. So there are certainly some polypore brackets that you could see on a tree and go, that tree is for it. Particularly things hortiporous, I'm trying to think, so root rotting fungi. If you're seeing brackets forming at the base of trees, they are most likely buttress root rotting species that are eventually going to mean that tree's base is going to be weakened and is likely to be wind thrown or split in high winds. Other brackets like the heartwood rotting ones are definitely not, as I said in the talk there, so they can be of a real benefit to the tree. And there are lots sort of in between. If you're seeing something like the birch polypore, which I think many people will know and recognise, that's something you're just going to see when a tree is already suffering some other horrific tree injustice. So it's either fire or pest, disease, something else has pushed that tree close to death, and then you're going to see the birch polypore becomes really active in the tree and helps finish it off, and you're going to start seeing those polypore brackets then. Yeah, I mean, what I'd say is, if anybody, like I think you said, Iona, I think my email address is on the BMS website. You can always say it's this on my tree and send us a photo, and I'll try and explain more detail. But yeah, it really does depend on the species in question.
Yeah, we have a lot of beech woodlands around where I am, and often when you see the big Ganodermas all around the buttresses on those, you sometimes find them are gone and not long later, but they can carry on for years as well. I've not heard that term that you mentioned for the really ancient veterans, the hulks.
Yes.
I love that.
And I can't not say it now because I really like the phrase, the term,
Yeah.
and I see them now as hulks on the landscape, like looking sort of strong and resilient. And so that's why I kind of stop myself saying it at any excuse.
I love it. Right. We've got a question from Claire. What book resources would you recommend for identification? Can you think of any that are particularly good for habitats as well?
Okay, so there's a few books up here behind me, and they I would definitely say they all have, yeah, there's lots and lots, and they all have their place, and they're all brilliant in their own way. So if I was going to say specifically for answering that question, and I say not that all the others aren't also great, I don't want to upset anyone, but you can't even see the whole cover. But the photographic Collins Complete Guide to British Mushrooms and Toadstools, the reason why, in relation to your question, is at the back of it, there is a section at the back that goes through oak woodland and oak associating fungi, and beech woodland associating fungi, and birch, hazel, ash, willow. So there's all these sections at the back. So in relation to that is like not many, if any, of the other books actually have a section where they go, these are some really common species you're likely to see if you're standing in that habitat. So it is a handy thing for a beginner. And as generally, if it's somebody that's just starting out, it's one of the more inexpensive books and fairly accessible, with a lot of mix of the common names as well as the scientific names and stuff like that.
I was looking to see if I could see my copy then, because we could have had a competition about whose is falling apart the worst, but I think mine must be
yours is
stuffed
completely
in a
gone.
bag somewhere.
Oh.
Well, you showed us lots of really nice pictures of wet habitats, which I thought, oh, I'd love to go poking around in them, but a lot of them did look quite treacherous. That seems kind of relevant to Roy's question. He's asking about, is climate change affecting fungi? Would that be something that you could comment on, or?
So, you know, I am getting asked this more and more for obvious reasons, and I'm definitely not the best placed person because I sort of don't do research in that field at all to answer it. But there are certainly so there are fungi that at the moment are restricted to southeast England. So the warmer climates that we have there, there's a whole lot of fantastic boletes, for example, that you're only going to find there in the country, thermophilic boletes. And although they have other restricting factors on their range, there are a lot of other species that it would seem that as the climate warms, they are going to benefit from being able to spread further into the country rather than less. Equally, species that we now see only from northern, so Western Europe may make it over here as well. But there is going to definitely be things. So looking at things like those wet woodlands, we are, on one hand, I forget the numbers, but it's well over 70% of wet woodland has gone in the last couple of 100 years because it was a habitat you could sort of, it was thought of as invaluable, had no value, and you could drain it and then either, well, mostly graze cattle on it or graze stock on it. But some of the best remaining areas, therefore, are all in the wettest places that it wasn't possible to drain and dry out. So at the side of lochs and lakes, riparian sort of riverside, and with increased rainfall in the UK, not necessarily coastal rises, but increased rainfall, those areas are going to get wetter and wetter and wetter until even the willows and the alders and stuff are unable to tolerate sort of permanent wet conditions over their roots. So we're likely to lose more of those habitats. There is research out there, but I don't think we fully understand, like it's almost on a species by species or genus by genus basis, quite what the effects of climate change on fungi are going to be yet. Certainly I don't, I'm afraid.
No, yeah, a big area for research, I think. Going back to the question about habitats and resources, we've got another comment from Lucas in the chat, who says, if you can read Dutch, which I can't, so I'm going to attempt this, the Ecologische Atlas van Paddenstoelen in Drenthe lists fungi by habitat, and it's available to download for free. So maybe with the magic of the internet, that's a resource that people could dip into. And I will also, in a minute, post a link to the SSSI selection guidelines for fungi habitats, because that is also quite a useful resource for getting lists of assemblages of special fungi that you can find in particular habitats. So we've also got a question from Russell here, who says, do you know of many or any UK examples of habitat restoration or rewilding projects where the fungal response has been monitored?
No, is the easy answer. So I'm not aware of any where that has been done as a matter of course. I'm aware of more from the opposite end, where people have been doing rewilding projects, which is something I really am genuinely very behind, but not having done fungal surveys beforehand. And that's always a little bit concerned that perhaps it's like, well, you know, you just come by a big tract of land and you go, I'm not having this as a sheep farm anymore. It's been grazed too long, and I would like to turn this land back to the wonderful wildwood it once was. But it might be that for the last 150, 200 years, fungi that specialized on that sheep grazed grassland are really specialists. They might be really rare, and if nobody goes around and checks first, it doesn't matter so much afterwards, no matter how good your tree planting, if you monitor the, if you spend the next 20 years monitoring the new woodland fungi that appear on the site afterwards, it's if no one ever checked beforehand which species might have been lost beforehand. Sorry, that's the opposite of answering your question. Sorry.
It's all relevant though, isn't it? And it's the before is as important as the after when you're thinking about the effects of these kinds of projects. Iona's asked, can you please recommend some resources for surveying fungi? So that's quite a big question. So I wonder if you could just talk us through, if you're going out to do a survey of a particular site, how would you approach that? What would you take with you? What would you do when you got back?
Okay. It does depend. I'm going to first of all divide it into there's a couple of different types of survey that I get asked to do. One is we have this piece of land and we would like to know all the fungi that we've got on it. And that sort of thing, we can say, well, I can give you a snapshot. I can come out and spend a day there and I can give you a snapshot of the fungi that were fruiting at that time, but I can't tell you the things that were even if that's a fantastic September afternoon and it's been raining for 6 weeks, I'll go, well, this is a lot of species, but I can't tell you what you're going to see in December or March or June, and there will be other species that are visible then. So one of the key things for a fungal survey is, if somebody wants to know really what they've got on the land, is repetition several times a year for several years, just to start building up a picture towards what you might find there. And for a survey like that, it really is following some of the sort of tips I was trying to sort of get across during the talk. And that would be, if I'm looking at a very large site, it's going to be difficult to walk sort of 1 meter transects, walk in a line for a straight line and then turn around and do the same line coming back parallel but 1 meter across, and then do it again and do it again. It would take me weeks and weeks to cover it. So I will usually plot a randomized route before going, and take a GPS with me and sort of follow a randomized route. So it's taking out me going, oh, look over there, I like that bit. Oh, it's sunnier over there. I might go, this bit's a bit hard to get through because it's lots of brambles. So it takes my bias out. I look, follow a more randomized route, and I go along and will just record every species that I'm able to in the field. If there are things that are particularly interesting, I will then collect them. Sorry, I should say, as I go through recording all the species there, I'm usually constantly clicking the GPS and making a note. I still use pen and paper rather than software to do that. But I then come away with a very big list of fungi, sit at home and do whatever microscopy it might have been needed, or spore prints or what have you, to confirm some of those other species. And then I'm going to make a spreadsheet up that lists all the species that were found with where they were found. So that's that kind of sort of generalist one. What I tend to get asked to do more, because people quickly realize how huge a task it is to find out all the fungi in the land, is, can we go and check this site for this species? Or can you go and check this site for this group of species? And then it's much more, I would use things like OS maps and Google Maps to have a look at aerial photographs of the site, identify areas that are more likely to have that species than not. So if it's a woodland species, I can write off all of the grassland areas, or vice versa. And again, sort of heading out then with a pre-written plan of where I'm going. And so one that I've had to do recently, it is essentially looking for a particular fungus that is almost always on a particular tree. and in every situation possible, look at as many of the trees as I possibly can. So zigzagging back and forth. And if there are 100 trees on that site, I'll have checked every one of the 100 trees. If there's 1,000, I may have done 200 or 300 of those trees, and stand and look at them, each one up and down, GPS in one hand, notebook in the other, and a basket at my side in case there are some specimens that I need to check for any reason. Does that sort of answer? I'm not sure.
Well, we'll let Iona come back to us in the questions. That I thought that was really useful. Now, there's a question about the Fern has mentioned that the RSPB are doing some wonderful work re-wetting woodland in the Blean complex in Kent. Now, I don't know if you'll know the Blean because it's quite a long way from where you live. But in general, have you had any knowledge of projects that have been re-wetting woodland? And do you know anything about how fungi might recolonize those areas? Like, do you think fungi are responsive to these kind of habitat restoration things, or not something that you have had much experience with?
Yeah, as you say, unfortunately, I don't know that one at all. So I don't know if it is a wetland, if it's something like a willow carr or mixed willow and alder carr already that had been damaged through drainage or other factors, and it's being restored, to which I would imagine, stuff should bounce back pretty quickly if the host trees and host plants and stuff are all still there. The only similar thing that I can think is a couple of sites that I've worked on up here in Scotland where there's been beaver reintroduction or indirect beaver reintroduction that has wetted up areas. But the initial effect of that is usually that there's a lot of the woodland is drowned at that point. So the beavers dam a bit of river, it floods an area, they will take down and create a lot of dead wood and stuff and wood chip, and so you get lots of species reacting to that. The sort of common species with a lot of spore mass around, and we are probably 10 or 20 years of seeing the fantastic sort of regeneration afterwards and how that goes. So yeah, sorry, that's one.
Thanks. Right, I think we're coming up to the end now. Just to let you know, you've got absolutely tons of people saying thanks, and that was really interesting and they really enjoyed it. We've got Sim has dropped a web link into the chat, which looks like it links to a report from the Natural England chief scientist, and that's not one that I've seen before, but it looks like there's a section in there on using eDNA, soil eDNA surveys to survey for fungi, and that is another method, which I think might get talked about in some of the other BMS talks. What have we got here from Russell? He says he's currently monitoring a trio of heathland restoration sites in the New Forest where nail fungus reappeared almost immediately following conifer removal, and he's found tiger sawgill on a newly restored riverine floodplain there. So a great example there of habitat restoration and the fungi turning up.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, so I think we're pretty much there. Cecile's jumped in with a question about what role does genotyping play for ID, but I think we will save the genomics questions for a future BMS talk. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add, Chris?
No, I'm overwhelmed by the amount of people that just signed in tonight, so I hope everyone at least took something away from it. It's been a pleasure.
I want to ask you the obvious question at the end, which is, have you got a favorite habitat?
So I do, love Atlantic oak woods, like sort of those really wet oak woods. Yeah. Yes, I definitely do, and it's them.
And it's them.
Yeah.
Super.
And it's not even necessarily because of the fungi in them. It's just they are life affirming to walk around in.
Have they got that kind of wild, wet, windswept
Yeah.
feel
So
to them?
yeah.
Lovely.
I don't know. I can't think of the right word, but something like Tolkien-esque. I don't know. Big warped trees and things like this. Yeah.
Make you feel like a wizard. No, they sound fab. Yeah, and a bit like getting into the deep ancient beech forests in Sussex, really getting away from it all. And yeah, Sue Moon says Celtic rainforest for us too. So lots of love for the wet woodland. So thank you very much, Chris. That was
No,
super.
thank you too.
I'm not sure if Sally's gonna pop back now or just switch us off at the end. But thank you very much to the BMS for hosting this talk tonight. Thank you to everyone in our audience for coming along. It's fantastic to see these events supported so well. And yeah, look forward to seeing people come along to future BMS talks. Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.